Okay, can everyone see that? I don't actually know how to adjust the font size at this point, but if you can't see it, I apologize. Yeah, so the title is probably true. I think we're going to talk about all those things. And I am Jake Prem. I guess I can look at my screen too. That probably makes more sense. And my notes should be on my phone. Okay, yes, so I am a software engineer at a company called TaxJar. I just started there. We do sales tax things for e-commerce. I worked at Smart Columbus before, and I have done Elixir at both of those roles, and other stuff that's not super relevant to this talk. Cool, yeah, so why are we talking about this? Oh, cool, if I touch the screen here, it changes here. Okay, but so why this talk? So how many of you have heard of Phoenix LiveView? Probably everyone, right? So Phoenix LiveView is kind of like the new hotness in Elixir, so to speak. There's a lot of buzz around it, and when there's buzz around a new technology, right, one of the first things you want to ask yourself is, if we're going to adopt this, how will we be able to test it, right? And so kind of along the same lines, TDD is test-driven development. We'll talk about that in a second. But TDD can be a useful strategy for developing features and making sure they work the way you expect them to. And then in addition to that, kind of based around some discussions we had at Smart Columbus when we were evaluating using LiveView, we kind of came to this point of understanding, okay, what actually is LiveView? What are things that have been built into Phoenix for years now? And because understanding the differences between those can really help you to evaluate the technology. LiveView itself is actually a very small part of Phoenix that enables real-time-ish features. But a lot of the stuff you're doing in LiveView has actually been baked into Phoenix for a very long time. And so we'll kind of cover some of that, and hopefully that will be helpful. Yep, so. All right, so just to cover the basics really fast. What is test-driven development? If you are really into test-driven development and are very much a purist, you might disagree with me about all these things I'm saying. But basically, the idea is to write your tests before you write your code. Some people would say you should have a failing test before you even define the module. I personally don't care that much about that kind of thing. My phone keeps going to sleep. But so TDD, at least in theory, is going to help you write better design code. Not just in that the code works better, but hopefully, as you think about how to write tests for your code, it will help you make better decisions about making the code modular and able to be updated easily, right? It validates your assumptions about how the code works. And so then over time, those assumptions you can prove again and again are correct. Just because you have a test for a feature does not mean that it actually does the thing you want it to, but it at least does what the test asserts it does, probably, right? And then finally, it makes it easier to jump into unfamiliar code. One of my first assignments or tasks at TaxJar was to add a new view to some unfamiliar Ruby code. And I'm very much not a Ruby developer, but by looking at the tests that were already there and writing tests for the new case, I was able to then validate as I did my implementation that it worked the way I expected and didn't have, I guess if they were unknown side effects, you really wouldn't know either way, right? But at least we could cover cases that we could think of what side effects might happen and cover it. But so I was able, right, using TDD makes it easier to jump into a code base you're not familiar with because you can at least write some basic assumptions into a test and see if the code does that once you make the changes. And then as you build up from there, it gives you better confidence in what your feature does. Okay, what about Phoenix? So Phoenix, as most of you are aware, at the Elixir meetup, right, it's an HTTP. Oh, interesting. My notes on my phone are lagging behind by a slide. But anyway, Phoenix is an HTTP framework, right? We could go into the whole stack of the Erlang VM to Cowboy to Plug to Phoenix to other things, but essentially Phoenix is a tool for routing HTTP requests coming from a client and routing it to your own custom code. So that's kind of the basis of Phoenix, right? Whether you have just a JSON API or some other kind of API, if you're serving HTML, if you're using LiveView, Phoenix, in all those cases, is routing that HTTP request to your custom code. So on top of that, then you have HTML generation utilities, right? And so that's where if your controller is actually going to return HTML to a client browser, then you're going to use some of Phoenix's tools to generate that HTML. And I put Ecto up there just because one of the interesting things about Phoenix is that Ecto right? The Elixir developers and the people who created Phoenix and Ecto were very upfront about the idea of separating their database access layer from their Phoenix layer. And so that's where you can see Phoenix very much focuses on that web request portion, and Ecto very much focuses on how do we interact with the database. And so they're like two very separate things that then can work together. And there are several bridging libraries that go into that. But I just thought I would mention that it's already kind of separated. Because then when we talk about LiveView, we kind of have that same idea of separation, right? LiveView builds on top of Phoenix, but LiveView, it's not baked into Phoenix in a way that's like super tightly coupled. It just adds additional functionality. Yeah, I guess so going back to Phoenix, this might just be easier to see once we actually look at the code. But right, so Phoenix is what, 5 years old? 6 years old. It's been around for quite a while. And Phoenix, right, because Phoenix came from, okay, so Jose Valim, right, he was a Rails core dev, and he was like, hey, there's some real frustrating parts of Rails, and I'd like to make something better. And long story short, he ended up creating Elixir out of that. And Phoenix kind of builds on top of those same frustrations of saying, hey, there are real limitations of Rails, but there are also things about Rails that are really good. So we're going to try to keep the good things and improve on the things that are frustrating. And that's kind of how we got Phoenix. And so a lot of those things that come from that Rails background are the HTML generation, a lot of the stuff around templating and managing sessions and all that. And all of that has been in Phoenix for a very long time now. So then what is LiveView? LiveView says, hey, we're writing all these JavaScript pages and single page applications. And in a lot of cases, I really don't want or need to write a whole React single page application. Really, I just want to add a few real-time features to my page. And so LiveView essentially is the idea of what if instead of writing a ton of custom JavaScript for these features, what if we could just write that primarily as Elixir code and leverage a single smaller JavaScript library to do the browser side, right? So LiveView, there is a JavaScript component, but instead of you writing custom JavaScript, most of the time that JavaScript component is going to handle the WebSocket lifecycle. It's going to receive events from your Phoenix server or your Elixir server, and then it's going to update the DOM for you, and you're not going to write more than like 5 lines of JavaScript within your application, right? They do expose hooks to do that, and there are cases when you would want to, but the basic premise is you're going to write like 5 lines of JavaScript to hook it up, and then you're going to only write Elixir after that. And so with that, it makes it easy to have page updates in real time. Well, real time. It makes it easier to do that by writing Elixir code. It's lower friction than a single page application. And if you want to experience that for yourself, pick any arbitrary feature you'd like to add in real time and code it as a like Elixir WebSocket API and a React application, and then code the same thing in LiveView, and you'll see that the friction is much lower. LiveView also lets us write idiomatic Elixir code. So if you actually look at a lot of LiveView examples, it will look very similar to the code you would see for a gen server because it's following that same callback idea that gen servers do. So compared to React, there's much less of a context switch. And like I was saying, it still leverages WebSockets and JavaScript under the hood. It follows the idea that the library itself is going to manage most of the socket and the JavaScript, and you're just going to write the Elixir code, the Elixir code that implements your business logic, essentially. Okay, so one of my questions that was somewhere in my notes that I can't see very well. Who in here has worked with Elixir? Just a quick show of hands, or not Elixir, sorry, Phoenix. Phoenix, has anyone worked with actually server-side rendering in Phoenix? Somewhat less, right? It seems like a lot of Phoenix usage really is around APIs, JSON APIs, sometimes WebSockets. Has anyone used, so then like building on top of the server-side rendering, has anyone worked in LiveView itself? Sikant, you've done this. I know, yeah, okay. And then what about testing? Has anyone written testing for like Phoenix server-side generated stuff? So this is the example. This is the example from Phoenix's webs, like the Phoenix guides for how to do testing of controllers. And this is pretty much as specific as I've ever been able to find them getting. They're basically like, hey, do a call against your route, and then look in that big old HTML string and see if the string you care about's in there. And I think in LiveView they're doing something a little bit more sophisticated in their internal stuff, but basically all the documentation I can find, they're just like, well, if it's in the string somewhere, it's probably good. And I think that's more of an omission of documentation than them saying that that's like the best way to do it. But so if you're not familiar though, this helloweb.con case, Phoenix will generate under whatever your application name is. It's like the one we're going to look at today. It's marketplaceweb.con case. And so when you use that, one of the things it does is imports some helper functions like this get. And that get is going to simulate like a browser doing a request against it. And then the HTML response there, that's going to pull out the HTML that was returned right here. And then this equals squiggly. If you haven't seen that before in Elixir, it's basically just a string contains. One thing that is helpful when you're doing a test, if you do a string contains and it fails, Elixir will just say that it expected truthy and got falsy. If you do this operator in a test, Elixir will say what the left side was and what the right side was. So if you can use this in your test, it's helpful because it'll give you more information when they fail. But essentially, the operation itself is a string contains. But yeah, so that's kind of what Elixir suggests, or what the docs show you. So let's go write a test, and this part might not be as much of a live coding because I kind of already wrote it. Okay, that's what's powering the HTML. That's my server. So this is where we'll run our tests. Can you guys see that? So another thing you can do in Elixir, if you did not know this, you can run specific tests. So you can do files or by lines. We'll just do the file right now. All right, so if I run my market controller test, cool, that test passed. So let's go look at what it was. All right, so here's our market controller test. The setup block, since this is a setup, it's going to run before each test case. And in this case, this kind of is out of scope, so to speak, but this market module has a sell widget, it has a buy widget, and has a list widgets function. And those do basically what you would expect. If you sell a widget, it'll add a listing for that. If you call list widgets, it'll return a list of all the widgets that are for sale. And if you call buy widget, it'll change the owner and set for sale to false. Not really important to any of the stuff we're doing, but we needed some kind of background to work with. So I was being lazy in my test, and I just made it so that for each test, it'll add one to the database, to the test database. And then when the test finishes, it'll go delete all of them. And that was just because I didn't want to worry about what was already there. Yes, sorry, I did it for the other one, and I forgot about this one. There. Cool, we can resize that. Okay, but yeah, so then we have a test here, right? So we've got kind of a block here of widgets tests, and it just does this very basic test to see if they're listed on the page. Also, this is running right now. So we have no widgets on the page. Here, we should do this. So if we call out here, right, so that's the list widgets function. And if you can see, there are none right now, right, in that list. And so if I do, can you guys see that still okay? So if we sell, Johnson can be the owner of this one, and I think the next one is name. Right, and so we didn't look at that code, but it's just some basic things you might expect to see in a marketplace. So if I sell that, and then I do a list again, cool, right? We can see that one was in the list. This is not a live view, right? So without refreshing the page, we're not going to see it. But once I do, it should show up. Okay, that's cool. I don't know why. So that doesn't show up right now. Oh, I know why, because I implemented it for the live view, but I didn't implement it for this one yet, because we're going to do it together. Okay. But anyway, so as you can see then, this page, right, does not display the widget that I just added, because it's not implemented yet, right? If we look at the controller, all it does is render our index.html and our index.html for the marketplace is just empty, right? So why is this test passing? right? So I add a widget, and the first parameter of this sell widget is the seller. And so I'm selling one with my name as the owner, and I'm asserting that my name is on there. But does anyone see why that's passing? It's because this string is over here, right? I mean, I just hard-coded this, but right, I'm welcoming the account name. So this test passes because the account name's already on the page from somewhere else. So because we just looked at the entire big old HTML response, now we've got a problem. And in fact, just to show you how ugly this is, right, we get this big old ugly string. And so I did that to show, but also like you might have things that are set to display false on the page, or like any number of things where this big string acts like it's there, but it's actually not. And so we need a better way to test our Phoenix controllers. So how might you do that, you might ask? There's a library that I like to use for this called Floki, but essentially by introducing an HTML parser, we can take that HTML string and then narrow it down to a more specific part of the page to then look for the strings that we care about. I personally like to take kind of a hybrid approach here. It's like you could get really specific and like add like IDs or specific classes to every element you care about. I kind of like to scope down to say like, okay, like this is the widgets table, so is the text I care about in the widgets table. But depending on your exact use case and what you care about, you might do it differently. Kind of the point is the tool's there, and once you're using the tool, you kind of have to evaluate the best way to do it. But okay, oh, that still can be full screen. I broke it. All right, I don't know what I'm doing anymore. That's fine though. Okay, so if we come back over here, we can take this inspect statement back out. So you may wonder, so how do we use Floki? And this is where the live coding happens. So we're going to just make a nice pipeline here. The formatter is going to get real mad about how I'm doing this. Okay, so we're still getting our HTML response here. So then we can pipe that into Floki. And I could show you where it is in the mix.exs, but you probably don't really care. Parse document, we're going to do the bang version because we don't want to get an OK tuple out here. And I guess just for fun, the output of Floki is not much prettier because it does this. But what Floki is really powerful for is you can do CSS selectors in a find. I'm not 100% sure how much, like if it's 100% in line with CSS selectors or just partly. But you can do common things like IDs. So if we have a widgets table now, and then finally we'll go and do a .text. I like to use this .text because it kind of shows you only text that's visible on the page rather than looking at all the markup. So if we do an insert there, it's not going to show you because there's nothing there, but right? So now this looks better. It's failing because we're only looking within a widgets table that doesn't exist yet. But it's not passing on a false positive anymore. Okay. All right, so we have a failing test. So you should all feel proud of yourselves. You all just became test-driven developers because we wrote a test and it doesn't pass. So if we go back to our controller, and I think I remember the syntax, right? We'll see, I guess, because we have a test that will fail now if it's not right. So if we go to our marketplace, we go to our market, and we list widgets. I guess we need to assign those to something. This will probably do something. Let's see. And I'm going to cheat and go to my LiveView. So just pretend that this isn't written yet, I guess. And I think I called it widgets table in this case. And they still don't show up. Why don't they show up here? That's weird. Cool, and that works. So yeah, because we'll look at it in a minute, but in the live view I had to make it a map instead of a list for reasons. But cool, right? So now that shows up there, and I think if we run the test again, I think it'll pass now. Cool, our test passes. Does anyone have any questions about that portion of this? I kind of went fast, but it's pretty straightforward. But basically, the main takeaway there is if you haven't considered it before, I really suggest using a tool like Floki. because your test now can be much more specific to the thing you actually care about on the page. Yeah. Okay, so that is that portion. Did we talk? We talked about LiveView. Yeah, so I'm not going to cover how to add LiveView to your Phoenix application because there's lots of documentation for that, and it's really boring because it's like open this config file and add this line, then open this one and add this other line. But if you get stumped on that, feel free to ask me directly or ask in our Columbus Elixir Slack or somewhere. I'd be happy to help. It just didn't seem worthwhile to go through all that right now. Does anyone have any questions up to this point? Let's see what let's just jump ahead. That's the last slide. Cool. So we're going to go do some things. All right, so that's the live view. We don't need this one anymore. We don't need this one. I was going to show you the widget too, but it's basically just an ecto schema. It has a description. It has a Boolean that asks if it's for sale. That should be set to true by default. Field name string. Yeah, so it's just your basic schema. I guess that's worth looking at. Okay. So if you haven't worked with LiveView before, I guess I'll at a high level cover what's going on in here. So your LiveView will typically have a render function. And this is, even while I was working on this some today, I noticed that the newer versions of LiveView, they've changed a lot. Like this mount function now takes params first. And so that's where LiveView is still a very new library, and there's lots of changes happening. I think they're at version 0.8.1 right now. And so that's kind of one of the points I was trying to make with the, like 95% of the server-side rendering part of Phoenix is very old and very stable, but the LiveView portion is still changing a lot. So that's just something to keep in mind as you would evaluate it or develop with it, that things do change from time to time. They're usually pretty easy to adapt to, but you might have to keep an eye out for that. But yeah, so this render, when you do it, is going to have your template. You still can point this render function at a file. Depending on the complexity of your application, you may or may not want to have your render inline here, or you might want to have it in its own file like you typically would with other controllers. In this case, it's small enough that I just put it inline. Our template here is, like you saw, I just copy and pasted it over the other one. It's the same basic idea. In this case, we're dealing with it as a map, and I did a map to make it easier to delete them later. So other things you're going to see in a live view, you're going to see a mount function, and this is kind of the entry point. So when a client connects here, this mount function will be called first, and if I remember right, it actually gets called twice, once in an offline capacity, and then once again in an online capacity once the JavaScript spins up. If you're interested, that's documented and we can talk about it, but again, it's kind of like specific stuff that once you get there, it's much easier to look at it in the documentation than for me to explain it right now. But yeah, so this mount function then is what's going to run when someone connects to our live view. And yeah, so like you can see I changed the URL and the page looks exactly the same because it's the same template. And yeah, so what do we do here? I also have this for sale widgets function, which I guess we can look at real fast. Yeah, so for sale widgets just creates this query that looks for that Boolean to be set to true, and it grabs all the widgets where that's true. So we get all those, then we do a map on it. So if you're newer to Elixir, map is going to go through each item in that enumerable and apply this function to it, and then take the return value and return a new enumerable. Map happens immediately when you run it. And so in this case, I'm just taking the widget and creating a tuple with the ID as the first element and the widget itself as the second. And because that's the format that if you do an enum.intoMap.new, this first piece will be the key and the second piece will be the value. And that's what you're seeing up here. So we're ignoring the ID because I don't actually care about it in the template. I just care about it for down here. And so then in the live view, this socket is kind of like the con in a controller, right? I closed out of the controller, but. Right, so to cover some Phoenix basics, this con is kind of like your view of the connection from the client, and then it's also how the response is going to get sent back without getting too much into detail on that. So this socket kind of fulfills the same function in your view. The socket has a process running under the hood, so there's a long-running thing in your server for each person that's connected. And so you can store then pieces of state for that client in this socket, which is what we're doing here with the assign. So we're assigning our list of widgets that we just retrieved from the database to widgets. And then, right, when you do an @widgets in your template, that is accessing this assign. And finally, for that piece, here's our test. So we have the same setup block here as the other test, and then we have essentially the same test also. The main difference you'll notice is we're using this live function. And so that live function is analogous to the get function in the other one that I don't have open. So basically this live function comes from LiveView. It actually combines two separate calls. So you can still break out and do like the same kind of get call that you would do in a controller test. And then you can do the live call as a second step. But unless you actually need that for some reason, you can just do live and it'll do all the connection setup. And then that returns an OK tuple. It returns this view, which we're not using in this test. And then it returns the HTML. And so then if you look at this, again, you can see we're making basically the exact same assertion that we were making in the controller. But you can see we've got two more tests here that we are going to implement. And so this view, we'll talk about more in a minute, but essentially this view is going to be kind of like your connection, or like this is your way of interacting with that socket from within the test, right? Because the idea of LiveView is that the page is going to update as things happen in the background. But if we only have a static HTML string, we're not going to be able to make assertions against things that happen after we first start that connection. So by having access to this view, we can call various functions that will give us an updated view of the HTML as events happen. Does that kind of make sense? That's kind of wordy, but. OK, so let's fire back up into our tests. Let's switch over to this file. Yeah, and so what we're going to see is that first test should pass, and the second two are not implemented. So this is actually a really powerful TDD pattern in Elixir. They've made it so that you can have a test with a name and just not add an implementation, and it'll just fail by default and say not implemented. And I find that to be really powerful when I'm doing TDD, when I know kind of the things I want to happen, because I can go ahead and start writing out all my test cases as not implemented tests. And it gives me a place to put them and kind of know what I'm working towards without having to like have a scratch file or something else. I can just say like, okay, for this feature, I'd like to be able to see the widgets get added in a live capacity. I'd like to see them get deleted from my page. And now that we're here, I can go and think about how I would want to do that. Right, and so, okay, how are we going to get them added live? This part's going to be the same. And actually, I probably will just cheat and, at least for the test, we're going to cheat a little bit. Thank you for your feedback. I didn't actually fully implement this test. But yeah, so what you can see then in this test is, oh, I see what we're doing. Yep, okay. So if we were to assert that cool seller is on the page here, right? Well, we can just hide this one because it passes. You can see, right, the only widget for sale in this case is going to be owned or sold by Jake Prem. And so then when we look in that table for cool seller to be there, it's not going to be there. So if we run that test now, hey, it's no longer not implemented, but now the assertion fails. And, oh, cool. Yeah, this is pretty cool. So when you do that flowkey.txt we saw earlier, this is what it actually outputs. So if we were to look at kind of this page, it's all the visible text within that table. And so it's actually like really powerful. I don't know exactly what it does. So if you have like $1 billion transaction based on this test that you're going to write, like maybe double check what it does. But at least for my use cases so far, it's been pretty reliable. But yeah, so actually though, what we want to do here is we want to refute the cool seller, right? So if you haven't seen refute before, it's the opposite of assert. And the reason for that refute is because Oh, the rest of the test was over there. But anyway, the reason we want to refute it is because we want to say, hey, we're going to look at the table, and we want to make sure that somehow that value wasn't already there. Otherwise, when we go to assert that it is there, we wouldn't know for sure that it actually got added. It might just be something else. All right, so cool. I aliased market. The formatter doesn't like that. Oh, what? How did... All right, something weird happened. How did this get one space over? Thanks, VS Code. All right, so we are going to sell a widget. And in this case, we're going to make it cool seller. Also, forgive my magic strings all over the place. Typically, I might not do this whole thing where we do it all over the place. And the cool seller is going to sell ice because they're cool. And the price can be $9. And so then we can add our refute as an assert. And then we'll run the test, and everything should pass, right? Nope, it still fails. And why does it fail? Because we didn't update our HTML. Right, so this HTML came from this call here. And so I guess I'll show a brief background to show you how this works. So when we sell a widget, one of the things we're doing is we're doing a broadcast here. And the quick overview is this is the topic that the message will get broadcast on. This is the event, and this is the payload. And so I lost my train of thought. So that's going to get broadcast. So our live view is going to need to listen for that event to happen, which it does not right now. And maybe I'll just cheat on this part a little bit too. So if we come back over to our live view, so if you remember earlier, I said this kind of behaves like a gen server. That includes having a handle info. So we're not necessarily going to talk about this right now, but there's also a handle event. So handle event kind of handles the more browsery kinds of things that you would do in a live view. So if you have a button on the page, if you have a text field, there's an attribute you can add on those that will then cause it to trigger an event back. And then those are all go into handle event. So that's kind of the live view specific piece. But if you have messages coming into your process not from that, those will come in as handle infos, just like in a gen server. If you have messages that come in that aren't part of a call or a cast, those also come to the handle info. So then this first argument here is the message, and the second argument is our socket again. And so what am I doing in this case? Where is market? Right, so market is broadcasting the widget. That's the test. And oh, hello, that can go away. Right, so the market, when we sell a widget, is broadcasting that there's a new widget for sale. This handle info then sees that new widget event, gets the widget, and it adds that to our list or our map of widgets. Does that make sense? So we have a new widget that just got added, and then on socket, we assign to widgets. We do a map.put. So we take the existing widgets, and we add a new one under the ID for the new one. And that will now show up on the page, and we can try it, and I think it'll work. It might not work, but it should work. All right, so then market, I did alias that, cool. Abe Lincoln, he's gonna sell his hat. And he's gonna want some money for that. And theoretically, it should show up there. I don't know why it didn't. Oh, I know why it didn't. What's that? Yeah, well, so the reason it didn't come is because I didn't subscribe to the channel or to the topic. So when we want to, this is a pattern, and there's a whole Phoenix LiveView repository or LiveView examples repo where they do these kinds of patterns. So if you want to see a more fleshed out example, I think it's under Chris McCord on GitHub. But if you want to see a more complete example, he's got one. But basically, one of the things if we want this to happen is we need to subscribe to that in our mount or somewhere else. Maybe you have a subscribe button on your page. But so by subscribing here, then we're telling Phoenix's channels and message routing capabilities that, hey, this socket, like this process in Elixir, we want to receive those messages. And so now if we do this again, nothing happens. If we restart our Phoenix server, though, let's see. And 10.0. Cool, that one worked. So I think when I set up my LiveView, I didn't set up all of my recompiles the right way, or live reloading. So probably that just didn't reload for us. But yeah, so now you can see as I add these, they show up on the page. And so if we jump back over to our test now, right, when we saw this widget, the test should still fail because we're not actually exercising that functionality within the test yet, right? Because our HTML comes in here. That broadcast, so what I was trying to show you, the broadcast is going to happen in the cell function. So our LiveView has received it, but we don't actually have updated HTML. And so then that's where we can do, we actually need the view now. So we can change that to the view, and I believe it's just render. Yep. So VS Code's being helpful, it's really small. But you can call render with that view, and it will return the new HTML. So our test version of the live view that's running through this will still get the message here. So then this render function is just updating our view of the HTML, so then we can assert against that. And I believe now when I run that, that test should pass. It still failed. All right, let's see why. Because I didn't save the test. Cool, so now we have 3 tests and 1 failure. And we're ready to implement our last test. And our last test, let me look at my Scratchpad again. I didn't write it gets deleted test, so that's fun. But it should be basically the same thing, right? So we're going to have, actually it's going to be the same test, just reversed essentially. So we can do assert that. In this case, the seller is going to be, ooh, is that that inspects in all of those. That's not cool. Well, we can delete it. And we can delete that one. And we can delete that one. What's my battery at? Cool, we have 2 hours of battery life left, so plenty of time here. Okay, cool, so that should work. This one, we are asserting that Jake Prem is there, so then we're going to want to call market.buy. And the buyer can be Johnson, the heckler. And, oh, we don't know the ID, do we? That's awkward. No, I'm not. I haven't really used those a ton, but especially not in this test. But what I can do is I can cheat a little bit and just delete all the widgets. And that should work fine for our purposes at least. Oh, no, wait, that won't work because that's not going to broadcast the message. So we will leave that for a different time. I'll still implement it. I'm just not going to write the test because actually, oh, we can have okay, we can have this. We can make this happen. So because when we sell the widget, we're going to get a handle on it, right? So then that's a setup block. So we should just be able to do this. Yeah, this will work. And then we just need to pull that out here. And so then now when I go back to sell it, oh, that's selling, not buying. But when we go back here, we can do widget.id. And that probably will work. It maybe won't work, but we'll find out. And then we're going to need to do, or we can just do the assertion with this in line. So we render, that's going to give us updated HTML. And we can do all this stuff to get to that. And we're going to refute that my name is on the table. And when we run that test, it should fail now because we haven't implemented it. It would help if we actually set up the connection. This is the fun of live coding. So if we do that and run it, I think that won't compile, or that won't crash, I mean. Yeah, so it's mad because, cool, so that's a really good sign because that is that's a message not getting handled. Because in that market, we're broadcasting a separate event, and in our live view, we're only handling this event, right? So we're gonna have a pattern match error because it's gonna look for a handle info that matches I think it's like sold widget or something is the event I called it. But so it's gonna look for a function that matches like, hey, I didn't find one. And what Elixir does then is it crashes because it's not JavaScript. It's not just going to try to make things work and do even worse things in the process. Widget sold, that's what it's called. But if we pull this handler back across to the market live view, and realistically, depending on what I was doing, I'd probably add a catch-all that logs something. It's like, hey, some weird message happened. But now if I do that and run it, I think the test will pass. It did not, because I asserted and didn't refute. Right? Yeah. So this should be a refute now, right? Because we're saying it's been bought, and there's some logic I didn't really go too much into, or no, we did, right? So we look for the for sale widgets, and when you buy it, it gets set to not for sale anymore because I didn't want to create like a whole listing API. But yeah, so now we can refute that I have any widgets on the page, and that test will pass. And I think that's basically it. So like over here, just to show on the page, let's see, let's put that. Cool, so if we put that over there, then you can see the page a little bit at the same time. So just to kind of show you market.buy widget. So if someone buys number 1, it blows up. That was recompile again, right? So it's worthwhile getting your live reloads to work when you do this. But now you can see that they disappear off the page as they're bought. Yeah. Does anyone have any questions over that? We kind of went through a lot there, but. Okay, so the basic point of this talk is Phoenix server-side rendering is really powerful even without LiveView. LiveView is a really powerful tool. It's still changing quickly, but it can be really helpful in a lot of cases where you don't actually need a full JavaScript front end. LiveView can let you get those interactive components without having a lot of overhead of having a separate code base. And if you're going to test, we talked about Phoenix and LiveView, but really if you're going to test like server-generated HTML and Elixir, using a tool like Floki can really help you to narrow down to the specific part of the page where you expect the change to happen. LiveView has a really good testing library. So we covered kind of just external events, but this is kind of small. But if you look, there are events, or there are, what would you call these? There are functions you can run in your test to simulate clicking on the page, to simulate the submitting events, the changing the key downs. And they work similarly to this render function. They just take some more things. And they've got examples. And yeah, so LiveView has good documentation for that. The LiveView documentation tends to be the most up-to-date place to find out about different pieces of it. I think that's pretty much all I've got. I did not put together a resources page on here. Does anyone have any questions overall? Okay, well, yeah, so hopefully that gives you kind of like a high-level overview. Hopefully it gives you some interesting ideas of how you might use LiveView or how you might approach using it, how you can write unit, like, if nothing else, hopefully it makes the idea of writing unit tests for LiveView way less scary, because I know for me, half the time I'm just like, okay, I know I want to write a unit test here, but like, what am I actually trying to assert on, right? And so kind of having some strategies to do the HTML. Hopefully that's helpful. But yeah, the biggest thing is you're going to have to spend time and read the documentation if you want to do these things. But it's all out there. It's really good. That's a great thing about Elixir. Yeah, that's all I've got. Oh, question, yeah.
So in your example, you have like the content, widgets, right? Mm-hmm. And you're rendering that whole template. But a lot of times, like, at least when I'm using WebSockets, I'll want to push incremental changes. And then the front end, like for instance, I have a giant chart with thousands of points on it. So like rather than add 1001, is there a way to just kind of send out the incremental change?
Johnson, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I'm pretty sure, so this LEEX template, like this L, I think does that for you. So one of the big pieces of LiveView is it's essentially running like a virtual DOM or a shadow DOM in Elixir on the server side. And then, or some piece of it's on the server side, and then they have a JavaScript piece on the front end also. But so they're actually only transmitting over the wire like the minimal set of changes to actually update the page. I think there might be a little bit of nuance to make sure you don't like break that, but generally it's pretty powerful. Just as an aside, some of you might be familiar with this, but what Phoenix actually does, not just in LiveView, but in like all of its templates, is it essentially, my understanding at least, is it comes in here and it's like, cool, this whole thing is just a binary, so like groups up that whole binary, like it makes it into a list, and so it's like, cool, here's a big binary, that's a piece of the list. Here's something that's dynamic, so that's like a separate piece. But Phoenix has these optimizations in place that kind of breaks up your template into the dynamic pieces and the static pieces. And so then my understanding is what LiveView does is when you first connect, it transmits all the static pieces to the front end. And then it only ever like will send over the wire these small update pieces that can change. But Chris McCord and Jose are very smart and they've made videos. And so your best bet for finding out more about that is to go find the stuff they've talked about on it. But my understanding, at least, is that they did a lot of work to optimize this and make it possible. Does that answer your question? Okay. Anyone else? Cool. Well, thank you for coming and listening to me ramble. I'll be around if you have questions, and I generally check the Columbus Elixir Slack, so if you ever run into problems with LiveView, I'd be happy to try to help you some there.